Moscow, 1941. As the German armies advanced toward the capital, Stalin vanished from public view for 11 days. Radio silence. No orders, no speeches, only rumors spreading through a terrified nation. The man the world would later call the Iron Will was, at that moment, paralyzed by disbelief. Yet Soviet propaganda would later turn this hesitation into legend, a myth of divine resilience. But the archives tell another story. Let's uncover what the Kremlin worked so hard to erase. Fact 1. The myth of the fearless leader. The official Soviet version of Stalin's behavior in June 1941 was simple. When Germany invaded, the Marshal of the Soviet Union took immediate control, mobilized the Red Army, and stood firm while others panicked. But the truth, documented in diaries and declassified reports, is far less heroic. On the morning of June 22nd, when German aircraft bombed Soviet airfields and columns crossed the frontier, Stalin was informed by his intelligence chiefs. His first reaction was disbelief, not rage, not resolve, but stunned silence. He had personally ignored over 80 separate intelligence warnings about a coming invasion. For years, he had believed Hitler would never betray him before finishing the war in the West. Now, confronted by reality, the dictator who ruled by fear was himself overcome by it. For the next 48 hours, his headquarters in the Kremlin remained eerily quiet. Ministers gathered, waiting for orders that never came. The first government directive was drafted not by Stalin, but by his subordinates. Marshal Zhukov and Molotov took charge of the situation while Stalin locked himself away at his dacha outside Moscow, surrounded by guards but refusing to answer his phones. On June 29th, when the Germans captured Minsk, Stalin reportedly murmured, "Lenin left us a great state, and we've ruined it." His entourage later recalled how he sat in an armchair, head down, whispering to himself that everything was lost. For nearly a week, the Soviet leader, the man later portrayed as the unbreakable architect of victory, did not govern. His return to the Kremlin on July 1st marked not a moment of resolve, but of necessity. The party apparatus had continued to function without him. Only after confirming that his power base was intact did Stalin resume control. When he finally addressed the nation on July 3rd, his voice on the radio trembled. The speech, carefully rewritten by his secretaries, avoided the word communist and opened instead with brothers and sisters, an emotional plea rather than a command. That moment, when the most feared man in the Soviet Union asked his people to endure what he himself could not face, remains one of the most revealing in his life. The myth of Stalin's iron will was born not from courage, but from silence. His strength came later, reconstructed by propaganda, polished by victory, and repeated until the world forgot that for 11 days, the Iron Man of Moscow simply disappeared. Fact 2. The myth of Stalin's genius. Strategy. The Kremlin's wartime myth portrayed Stalin as a military mastermind, the generalissimo, whose instinct and intellect guided the Red Army from disaster to victory. Textbooks, parades, and even post-war films painted him as the architect of triumph at Stalingrad and Kursk, a man whose strategic brilliance rivaled Napoleon. But Soviet military archives, opened decades later, revealed a darker truth. Stalin's orders in 1941 and 1942 nearly destroyed the Soviet army before it ever began to win. In the first 6 months of the war, Stalin personally approved every major operational decision. He refused to authorize retreats, believing any withdrawal was treason. When German forces encircled entire Soviet armies near Kiev, his stand and die order sealed the fate of nearly 700,000 soldiers, the largest single loss in military history. His generals begged to maneuver, to retreat, and regroup. Stalin's response was brutal. Not a step back. Those who questioned him were dismissed or executed. The same blindness led to the destruction of the Western and Southwestern fronts. Cities were lost not through cowardice, but through orders that denied logic and geography. His obsession with control reached absurd levels. He personally altered operational maps, repositioned divisions he had never seen, and dictated directives based on his own understanding of German intentions, which was often catastrophically wrong. Stalin trusted no intelligence except his own assumptions. The result was chaos. Commanders received contradictory orders, supply lines collapsed, and soldiers froze or starved, waiting for orders that made no sense. The Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941 succeeded not because of Stalin's genius, but because of German exhaustion and the brutal resilience of ordinary soldiers fighting in conditions their own government had failed to prepare them for. By the summer of 1942, his interference had become a national liability. It was only after the catastrophic encirclement at Kharkov that senior officers, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Shaposhnikov, persuaded him to step back. Reluctantly, Stalin delegated operational planning to the general staff. Only then did Soviet strategy begin to evolve into what would eventually crush the Wehrmacht. Yet, after victory, Stalin rewrote the story. Orders he had resisted became his own ideas. Plans conceived by others were attributed to him in official memoirs. Even maps were altered to make his decisions look far-sighted. The irony of Stalin's military genius is that it was born from disaster. He learned through humiliation, not foresight. Millions died under his early mistakes. Soldiers sent to hopeless fronts, civilians trapped in encircled cities, commanders executed for obeying impossible orders. The real victory belonged to those who survived despite him, not because of him. But in the post-war world, that truth was unthinkable. Stalin could not be seen as human. He had to be infallible. So the myth endured. The Iron General who never wavered, when in reality, his first victories were built on the ruins of his own pride. Fact 3. The myth of Stalin's compassion for his people. To millions of Soviet citizens, Stalin was presented as the father of nations, a man of the people, simple, humble, and endlessly devoted to the workers and peasants who built his empire. Statues showed him smiling beside farmers and children. Films portrayed him visiting factories, speaking softly to soldiers, and weeping over fallen heroes. But behind the polished portraits and choreographed photographs was a man utterly indifferent to human suffering, even when that suffering was the price of his own mistakes. In the winter of 1941-42, while Moscow starved and froze, Stalin's private kitchen continued to serve imported wines, Caucasian fruits, and Georgian dishes flown in by special rail convoys. He often dined while listening to orchestras or watching films in the Kremlin's private cinema, even as thousands died each day in the surrounding streets. Reports from the NKVD, his secret police, described entire neighborhoods reduced to silence. People burned furniture to survive the cold. Bread rations fell to 125 grams per day in besieged cities. But Stalin dismissed these reports with a simple phrase: "The people must learn endurance." Even his supposed concern for soldiers was a myth carefully constructed by propaganda. When letters from the front began reaching Moscow describing starvation, lack of ammunition, and mass desertions, Stalin ordered that future correspondence be censored. Any complaint was labeled defeatism. Prisoners of war were not seen as victims, but as traitors. In August 1941, he signed Order No. 270, declaring that any soldier who surrendered must be considered a criminal and his family subject to arrest. Tens of thousands of wives and children were punished simply for the shame of their husband's capture. Among them was Yakov Djugashvili, Stalin's own son. Captured by the Germans near Smolensk, Yakov was offered in exchange for a German field marshal. Stalin refused, replying coldly, "I do not trade soldiers for generals." His son later died in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, either shot while trying to escape or executed after refusing Nazi propaganda demands. Stalin's reaction was not sorrow, but fury that his name had been linked to weakness. Behind every display of compassion, there was calculation. When he visited wounded soldiers in 1943, newsreel cameras were staged to catch his spontaneous warmth. When he sent condolences to families, his secretaries drafted the letters. He never signed them himself. Even his famous phrase, "Life has become better, comrades. Life has become merrier," was delivered in 1935, during the height of famine and purges. For ordinary people, those words sounded like mockery. Stalin's emotional distance was not just personal, it was policy. He viewed suffering as fuel for loyalty, misery as proof of strength. To the outside world, he was a leader of granite resolve, weeping only for the nation's pain. But to those who lived beneath him, the truth was simpler and colder. He never wept at all. The father of nations was a father who demanded sacrifice, not love, and gave nothing back but silence and fear. Fact 4. The myth of Stalin's unbreakable morality. Soviet propaganda often painted Stalin as a man of unshakable moral discipline, incorruptible, sober, devoted entirely to duty. He was said to live simply, to shun luxury, to care nothing for comfort or pleasure. Photographs showed him in a modest office, dressed in a plain tunic, surrounded by paperwork and maps. But the private world of Joseph Stalin was built on the very corruption, cruelty, and hypocrisy that his regime claimed to destroy. Inside the walls of the Kremlin, a different Stalin lived. He drank heavily during long night banquets that could last until dawn. His inner circle, Beria, Molotov, Mikoyan, and others, would gather at his dacha in Kuntsevo, where the dictator tested their loyalty not through politics but humiliation. Guests were forced to sing, dance, or tell jokes on command. Those who failed to amuse him were mocked or suddenly removed from public life. The dinners often ended with Stalin pacing the room, muttering suspicions aloud, watching who laughed and who didn't. Many who sat at his table one evening would be arrested within days. His morality, so loudly celebrated in public, was a mask worn over deep insecurity and cruelty. Women who worked near him described a man capable of sudden tenderness, followed by cold disgust. His second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, shot herself in 1932 after an argument during one of his drunken feasts. The regime claimed it was illness. The truth was that she could no longer bear the lies and the purges he had unleashed. Stalin's reaction was silence. He refused to attend her funeral, then ordered that no one speak of her again. For years afterward, her name was erased from official records. While millions of ordinary citizens were imprisoned for minor thefts or anti-Soviet talk, Stalin's loyalists lived like feudal lords. Lavish apartments, imported cars, and secret shops filled with Western goods were reserved for the elite. Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's feared security chief, was notorious for using his power to abduct women from the streets of Moscow, crimes known but ignored by the man who claimed to embody socialist virtue. When Beria's predations became too visible, Stalin merely laughed it off, saying, "Beria has his weaknesses." Even religion, which he claimed to despise, became a tool of convenience. During the war, he suddenly rediscovered the Orthodox Church, reopening seminaries and appointing bishops, not out of faith, but to rally the population behind him. His supposed morality was a shifting instrument of control. Atheism when it suited ideology, sanctity when it suited victory. The myth of Stalin's purity endured because it served a purpose. A ruler who demanded absolute obedience needed to appear beyond human vice. Yet the truth was the opposite. His public modesty was performance, his private life a theater of fear and indulgence. He preached moral strength while feeding on weakness, denouncing corruption while rewarding it. In the end, Stalin's unbreakable morality was not the absence of sin. It was the perfection of hypocrisy. Fact 5. The myth of Stalin's perfect control. For decades, the Soviet story insisted that Stalin ruled an empire of flawless discipline, a single will directing every soldier, worker, and commissar. His portraits hung above factory floors and military headquarters, symbolizing absolute command. Official histories described him as omniscient, aware of every decision, correcting every error, foreseeing every move. Yet the archives tell another story. Beneath the surface of that supposed order was chaos, fear, and paralysis. Stalin's perfect control was an illusion, one that cost millions their lives. From the very beginning of the war, The Soviet command structure was suffocated by terror. Officers who failed were not reprimanded. They were executed. In 1941 alone, more than 10,000 commanders were arrested or shot for cowardice, often after losing battles that no one could have won. Even simple acts of initiative could be interpreted as betrayal. One general later recalled that to disobey Stalin's orders meant death, but to obey them sometimes meant the same. The result was paralysis. Commanders waited for written permission to move troops, even when surrounded. Soldiers attacked fortified positions without artillery or air support because no one dared cancel an order signed by Comrade Stalin. The NKVD, his secret police, shadowed every army unit. Political officers sat in every headquarters, monitoring loyalty rather than strategy. A careless word could end a career. Reports were rewritten to flatter Moscow. Failures were buried, victories exaggerated. Stalin's control was total in appearance, but hollow in practice. His subordinates lied to survive, feeding him the victories he wanted to hear. When ammunition ran out, they reported temporary shortages. When divisions disappeared, they wrote that they had fought heroically to the last man. Stalin ruled through fear, but fear made truth impossible. Even in civilian life, the same chaos reigned. Orders for production, housing, or rations contradicted one another. Ministries duplicated tasks, hoarded resources, or sabotaged rivals. Bureaucrats competed to guess what Stalin wanted before he said it. Some built entire industries based on rumors of his preferences, a new tractor model, a particular steel alloy, only to see them condemned weeks later as wasteful deviations. Every decision, from tank design to bread distribution, was a gamble on the mood of one man. Yet the myth of his control survived because no one dared expose its failures. When things went wrong, Stalin blamed others, wreckers, enemies of the people, foreign agents. When things went right, his name appeared in every headline. The propaganda machine converted coincidence into wisdom, improvisation into foresight. He became, in the public imagination, the conductor of a flawless symphony. But in truth, Stalin's regime was an orchestra without harmony, each player terrified to make a sound. Orders came from the top, but reality rarely followed. By the war's end, the Soviet Union had triumphed not because of his perfect control, but despite its absence. It was chaos disguised as discipline, dictatorship mistaken for direction. Behind the myth of omnipotence stood a single man, haunted by the only thing he truly couldn't command: the truth. Fact 6. The myth of Stalin's unquestionable popularity. The Soviet propaganda machine loved to show Stalin as a beloved father, cheered by crowds, adored by peasants, worshipped by soldiers. Films showed him embraced by workers, receiving flowers from children, his name chanted like a prayer. Every victory, every harvest, every sunrise was said to happen under his benevolent gaze. But behind the forced smiles and orchestrated parades was a nation that obeyed out of fear, not devotion, a population silenced into applause. The so-called adoration began with compulsion. In the 1930s, newspapers published letters of gratitude addressed to Stalin by miners, mothers, or teachers, all written by government editors. Local officials were required to organize public demonstrations of loyalty. When the Great Terror began in 1937, those same officials learned that a single joke, a whispered complaint, or a missing portrait on a wall could end in arrest. Crowds that greeted Stalin's train with cheers did so under the watch of secret police. Every shout of "Long live Stalin" was an act of survival. In rural areas, the myth was even crueler. The collectivization campaign had shattered the countryside. Entire villages were deported for resisting state farms. Families starved during the Holodomor in Ukraine and across the Volga region. Yet official reports described enthusiastic peasants celebrating the new socialist life. When famine victims begged for food, propaganda posters showed smiling farmers delivering record harvests to "our great leader." It was not love, it was terror wrapped in ceremony. Even within the army, devotion was fragile. Soldiers carried Stalin's portraits into battle because they were told to. Orders from the political commissars made it clear to question his leadership was treason. When morale collapsed in 1941, Stalin's image was used as a substitute for faith. He became both God and warden. The Order Number 227, not one step back, turned patriotism into compulsion. Behind the posters and medals lay firing squads waiting for anyone who retreated. That kind of loyalty was not born of respect, but of exhaustion and fear. Yet after victory, Stalin ensured that no other emotion could exist. Public mourning was forbidden when millions never returned home. Monuments bore his name, not the names of the dead. Entire generations grew up learning that gratitude to Stalin was a moral duty, the only acceptable form of love. School children were taught to thank him for their lives, for their food, for their very breath. But in private, the truth lingered. In whispered kitchens, behind closed doors, families told a different story, of fathers arrested at night, of empty chairs at dinner tables, of neighbors who vanished after praising the wrong person. When Stalin died in 1953, millions did cry, but not all from grief. Some wept from fear of the unknown, others from relief that the nightmare might finally end. The myth of Stalin's popularity was perhaps his greatest invention. It turned obedience into affection, terror into faith. The crowds that seemed to worship him were not celebrating a man. They were surviving one. Fact 7. The myth of Stalin's unerring justice. The official story claimed that Stalin was a man of strict but fair justice, that his purges and arrests, though harsh, were necessary to defend the revolution from spies and traitors. Soviet textbooks called them precautionary measures. Newspapers praised his vigilance, saying no innocent person could suffer under his watch. Yet the historical record reveals the opposite. Stalin's justice was not law. It was theater, performed through fear, confession, and death. The Great Purge of 1937 to 1938 turned the entire country into a prison. It began with a single secret directive, ordering the NKVD to eliminate anti-Soviet elements. What followed was a wave of arrests that defied logic. Entire factories were accused of sabotage, universities of espionage, and army officers of plotting coups. Quotas were issued, not investigations. Local NKVD chiefs were told how many enemies to arrest each month, sometimes by the thousands. Those who failed to meet their numbers were themselves declared suspects. The result was mechanical madness. Villages without a single spy were forced to invent them. Inside interrogation cells, justice became ritualized cruelty. Prisoners were beaten, deprived of sleep, and forced to sign pre-written confessions admitting to impossible conspiracies, working for the Japanese, the Vatican, or the Trotskyites, sometimes all at once. When they hesitated, interrogators whispered the same line: "Confess, or your family will follow you." And they did. Wives were branded family members of traitors, deported to remote camps. Children were sent to orphanages with new names so they could not infect others with their parents' guilt. Show trials filled theaters in Moscow. Cameras rolled as once loyal revolutionaries confessed to crimes they had never committed, trembling before the microphones, reading from scripts approved by Stalin himself. The verdicts were predetermined: death by firing squad. The transcripts were published in newspapers the next morning. Citizens read them aloud, pretending to believe. They had to. Silence could mean suspicion. Even after the war, Stalin's justice continued its shadow work. Returning Soviet prisoners of war were interrogated as potential collaborators. Many were sent directly from liberation camps in Germany to the Gulag. Soldiers who had survived Nazi captivity now found themselves accused of treason to the motherland. In the Baltic states and Eastern Europe, entire populations were deported under decrees signed for state security. There were no trials, no defense, no appeal. Stalin's idea of justice was simple. Guilt was not determined by evidence, but by usefulness. A confession could justify a purge. An execution could solve a political inconvenience. To be innocent was irrelevant. Everyone was potentially guilty of something. By the time the purges ended, nearly 1 million had been executed, and millions more imprisoned. Yet Stalin's portraits still hung in courtrooms, smiling above the words, "Justice of the Soviet State." To question his fairness was to question the system itself. Even after his death, when Khrushchev exposed parts of the terror, official language softened the truth, calling it errors, not crimes. The myth of Stalin's justice endures because it was built on fear so deep that even survivors spoke carefully. In truth, his courts did not deliver justice, they erased it. His laws did not protect citizens, they protected him. And in that world of reversed meanings, where innocence was guilt and confession was survival, Stalin's so-called fairness became the most terrifying lie of all. Fact 8. The myth of Stalin's loyalty to his allies. During the Second World War, Soviet propaganda depicted Stalin as the steadfast ally of Roosevelt and Churchill, the iron partner who bore the heaviest burden of the fight against fascism. The official narrative told of trust and cooperation, three giants united to save civilization. But behind the smiling photographs of the Big Three conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam lay an ocean of suspicion, manipulation, and betrayal. Stalin's loyalty, like his friendship, was a weapon, wielded only for advantage. From the beginning, Stalin viewed his Western allies not as partners, but as pawns. When Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, he begged for help: aircraft, tanks, supplies. Roosevelt responded with the Lend-Lease program, which sent billions of dollars worth of equipment through Arctic convoys. Stalin accepted it without acknowledgement. He refused to allow American observers near the front and denied British requests for joint operations. He distrusted everyone, even as he depended on them for survival. His messages to Churchill were often cold, accusatory, and manipulative, demanding a second front in Europe while concealing the true state of his armies. At the same time, Soviet intelligence spied relentlessly on its allies. NKVD agents in Washington and London intercepted communications, recruited informants, and penetrated atomic research projects. Stalin personally received reports on Allied decisions before they were publicly announced. The Kremlin celebrated the alliance in speeches, but in secret, Stalin prepared for the day it would end. His foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, once described the Allied conferences as a temporary truce between predators. At Yalta in 1945, when victory over Nazi Germany was near, Stalin smiled for cameras while quietly redrawing the map of Europe. Promises of free elections in Poland and Eastern Europe were made with no intention of keeping them. Within months, Soviet occupation transformed those countries into satellite states. Political opponents were arrested, press freedoms abolished, and puppet governments installed. When Roosevelt's advisors protested, Stalin replied dryly, "Whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. It cannot be otherwise." His betrayal extended beyond Europe. After signing a neutrality pact with Japan in 1941, Stalin violated it 4 years later, invading Manchuria only when Japan was already collapsing, a move designed to secure territorial spoils, not moral victory. He then claimed credit for hastening the war's end. Even among his own generals, loyalty was conditional. Marshal Zhukov, the hero of Berlin, was exiled soon after the war because his popularity threatened Stalin's supremacy. Gratitude was never part of his vocabulary. Stalin's diplomacy operated on a single principle: trust no one, use everyone. He treated alliances like chess openings, temporary positions to be sacrificed once the board changed. The West wanted peace. Stalin wanted dominance. His loyalty to his allies lasted only as long as it served his vision of empire. After his death, the Kremlin continued to celebrate the wartime alliance as proof of Soviet virtue. But the documents reveal a colder truth. Stalin never trusted Roosevelt's idealism or Churchill's charm. He saw them as naive tools of capitalism. The Iron Curtain that descended after 1945 was not a sudden reaction. It was the natural outcome of Stalin's worldview. For him, friendship was weakness, cooperation a tactic, and betrayal simply the next move in a game he believed only he understood. Fact 9. The myth of Stalin's economic miracle. For generations, Soviet citizens were told that under Stalin's leadership, the USSR transformed from a backward peasant nation into an industrial superpower, a miracle of planning and discipline. Propaganda films showed glittering steel mills, endless columns of tractors, and heroic workers singing beneath red banners. The message was clear. Stalin's iron hand had built a modern empire out of chaos. But the truth, buried under decades of fear and falsified statistics, was that this miracle was soaked in blood, hunger, and lies. The foundations of Stalin's industrial triumph were laid in terror. Beginning in 1928, his 5-year plans demanded impossible targets for production. Entire cities were built overnight: Magnitogorsk, Kuznetsk, Norilsk, but their workers lived in mud huts without food or heat. Engineers were arrested for sabotage when machines broke or quotas weren't met. The Gulag became the silent engine of progress. Millions of prisoners, labeled enemies of the people, dug canals, mined coal, and built railways under brutal conditions. At Belomor Canal, thousands froze to death constructing a waterway too shallow for ships. When it opened, Stalin praised it as a triumph of socialist labor. The so-called agricultural revolution was even more catastrophic. Stalin's forced collectivization, the seizure of private farms and livestock, aimed to feed the growing industrial cities. Instead, it triggered famine on an unimaginable scale. In Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, entire villages were stripped of grain by state requisition teams. Starving peasants were forbidden to leave their regions. Guards patrolled train stations to stop them. Between 1932 and 1933, over 5 million died. Yet official reports described a successful harvest and enthusiastic collectivization. When foreign journalists tried to expose the truth, Stalin expelled them or silenced them through loyal intermediaries. Industrialization itself was a pyramid built on deception. Ministries inflated numbers to meet plan requirements. Factories produced unusable goods just to fulfill quotas. Steel output doubled on paper, while machinery rusted unused in warehouses. Even military production was riddled with corruption. Tanks without engines, aircraft without instruments, rifles that jammed after the first shot. But none of that appeared in the newspapers. Instead, Stalin's portraits decorated every plant, accompanied by slogans like, "Thanks to the great leader for our happy labor." Behind this facade, the true economy was one of exhaustion. Workers collapsed from 12-hour shifts. Families lived in overcrowded dormitories. Basic goods, soap, shoes, bread, vanished from shelves. Yet any complaint could be labeled anti-Soviet propaganda. A single remark about shortages could land someone in a labor camp. Stalin's miracle demanded not efficiency, but silence. And still, the myth endured because it contained a sliver of truth. By 1941, the USSR was industrialized, but at a monstrous cost. The factories built by fear would later produce the weapons that stopped Hitler's armies. The roads carved by prisoners would carry the tanks to Berlin, but the people who built them never saw that victory. They were buried beneath it. After the war, Stalin's economists rewrote history. Famine disappeared from the records. Gulag labor was reclassified as voluntary rehabilitation. The Soviet people were told they had triumphed because of discipline and vision. In reality, they triumphed because they had no other choice. The myth of Stalin's economic genius turned suffering into statistics and death into development. The skyscrapers of Moscow and the medals on his chest were monuments to endurance, not success. His miracle was real, but it was a miracle that consumed the very people who made it possible. Fact 10. The myth of Stalin's invincible security state. For decades, the Soviet Union projected an image of unbreakable control, a fortress of order guarded by Stalin's secret police. The NKVD, later the MGB, was presented as a flawless shield against spies, saboteurs, and enemies of socialism. Propaganda posters showed vigilant officers catching foreign agents in dark alleys, protecting the motherland from capitalist plots. To the public, Stalin's security state was omnipotent, everywhere, always watching, always victorious. But the truth hidden in the archives shows a different story. A paranoid empire so consumed by its own fear that it devoured itself. The machinery of Stalin's security system was vast, but it was built on sand. Informers filled every apartment block, factory, and army unit. A careless word overheard in a queue could trigger an arrest. By 1938, more than 1 in 10 citizens had been denounced at least once. But the scale of surveillance made it meaningless. The NKVD could not distinguish truth from rumor, loyalty from self-preservation. People accused their neighbors to survive. Others invented conspiracies just to fill quotas. Stalin demanded constant vigilance, and so the machine produced enemies, endlessly, automatically, until it consumed millions of innocent lives. Even at the highest levels, fear ruled. NKVD officers themselves became victims of their own terror. The heads of the security services, Yagoda, Yezhov, and later Beria, were successively executed or disgraced, each accused of treason by the man who had appointed them. Stalin's invincible police lived in constant dread, knowing that the wrong gesture, a delayed report, or a rumor whispered by a rival could end with a bullet in the skull. Their interrogations became more brutal as they tried to prove loyalty through cruelty. The more they tortured, the safer they felt. For a time. When war came in 1941, the weakness of this system became clear. The NKVD had imprisoned or executed so many experienced officers that the Red Army was crippled by paranoia. German agents moved through the chaos of invasion almost freely. Soviet counterintelligence, obsessed with imaginary traitors, often ignored real ones. In occupied territories, local collaborators used Stalin's own terror tactics against his regime. People who had once feared the NKVD now joined the invaders to save themselves. Even in victory, the illusion of security masked chaos. After 1945, the USSR faced a wave of desertions, black markets, and unrest. The NKVD responded with mass arrests, deportations, and show trials. In Western Ukraine and the Baltic states, entire families were loaded into cattle cars for reliability checks. The more the Soviet state tried to prove its strength, the more it revealed its fragility. Stalin's empire did not rest on trust or unity. It rested on terror so absolute that even the executioners feared execution. Perhaps the greatest irony was that Stalin himself became a prisoner of his own system. By the early 1950s, he trusted no one, not even his doctors. He dismissed his longtime physician in the so-called doctor's plot, accusing Jewish medical specialists of conspiring to poison him. Many were arrested, beaten, or killed. In March 1953, when Stalin collapsed in his dacha, his guards hesitated to enter the room. They feared it was a test, that helping him might be seen as a crime. For hours, he lay on the floor, gasping, half-conscious, surrounded by men too terrified to act. The man who built the mightiest security machine in history died unguarded, undone by the very fear he had cultivated. His secret police could silence a continent, but not their own terror. The myth of Stalin's invincible state ended as it began, in paranoia, confusion, and silence. Fact 11. The myth of Stalin's visionary leadership after the war. When the guns of Europe fell silent in 1945, Soviet propaganda crowned Stalin as the architect of peace. Posters showed him gazing toward a bright socialist future, pipe in hand, as new cities rose from the ruins. Schoolbooks taught that under his vision, the Soviet Union would rebuild faster, stronger, and fairer than any nation on Earth. Western journalists visiting Moscow saw clean boulevards, new factories, and triumphant parades. It seemed for a moment that Stalin had turned victory into renewal. But behind the banners and medals, post-war reality was not reconstruction. It was exhaustion, repression, and decay disguised as progress. The Soviet Union emerged from the war shattered. 27 million dead. Entire regions burned, railways destroyed, and villages erased from the map. Ordinary people expected peace to bring relief. Instead, Stalin declared a new war, an internal one. He demanded reconstruction on the same brutal principles that had built his pre-war empire: forced labor, impossible quotas, and fear. Prisoners from the Gulag were sent to rebuild railways and mines. Captured German engineers were forced to work in Soviet plants. Soldiers returning from the front found themselves interrogated by the NKVD, suspected of being contaminated by the West. Many were sent straight from victory parades to prison camps. Stalin's vision for post-war recovery ignored human need. Factories resumed production of tanks and artillery, even as civilians lacked housing and food. When citizens complained, newspapers called them spoiled by wartime aid. In Ukraine, where famine reappeared in 1946, peasants watched grain shipments sent abroad to pay war debts while their own children starved. Yet official reports celebrated record harvests. Historians now estimate that nearly 1 million died in that famine, a silent tragedy erased from the Soviet story. Meanwhile, Stalin's paranoia only deepened. The Iron Curtain that fell across Europe was not just a geopolitical barrier, it was the border of his fear. He viewed the newly conquered lands of Eastern Europe not as liberated allies, but as future threats. Communist parties were forced to purge unreliable members, leaders replaced with Moscow loyalists, economies molded to feed the Soviet system. In Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, those who resisted were branded fascists or spies. The same machinery of terror that had once crushed Russia now spread across half a continent. Domestically, Stalin's obsession with control strangled innovation. Scientists who deviated from official dogma were denounced. Geneticist Nikolai Vavilov died in prison for challenging the pseudoscience Stalin preferred. Writers were ordered to praise socialist optimism or face censorship. The same man who had promised a new dawn created a twilight of fear. Even his closest allies were not safe. In 1949, he accused Jewish intellectuals of plotting against the state, a campaign that led to purges, executions, and the infamous Doctor's Plot. The truth of Stalin's post-war leadership was that it offered no vision at all, only repetition. The very system that had survived war now began to rot from within. Infrastructure crumbled faster than it could be repaired. Corruption flourished in the shadows of bureaucracy. The people, weary from decades of sacrifice, learned to live in quiet hypocrisy, praising a leader they no longer believed in. When Stalin died in 1953, he left behind no plan, no direction, no ideology beyond fear itself. His visionary legacy was a nation that had learned to build under pressure, but not to breathe in peace. The myth of his post-war genius endured only because the truth was unbearable, that the man who had once ruled the future had left his country trapped in the past, staring at a victory that felt more like defeat. Fact 12. The myth of Stalin's immortality and legacy. When Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953, the Soviet Union fell silent, not out of devotion, but disbelief. For nearly 3 decades, he had been presented as more than a man, an immortal figure, the mind of the revolution, the heart of the people, the son of nations. Schoolchildren swore oaths to his name. Poets compared him to God. His face gazed down from every classroom and factory wall, a symbol of permanence in a world of fear. No one dared imagine a USSR without him. But when the immortal leader finally collapsed, reality shattered the myth he had spent a lifetime building. The official announcement described his death as a tragic loss for humanity. State radio repeated it for days. Citizens were ordered to mourn. Across the country, processions of workers marched in silence, portraits of Stalin held high, tears mixed with uncertainty. But beneath the grief was confusion. What happens when a god dies? Entire cities shut down. People wept because they thought they were supposed to. Others hid in their homes, afraid to speak aloud what they really felt. Relief. For the first time in decades, the man who had ruled their dreams and nightmares was gone. The chaos that followed revealed how fragile his empire truly was. Power struggles erupted within hours. Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev maneuvered for control of the state Stalin had left without clear succession. Ministries functioned only by inertia. No one wanted to make a decision without the man whose approval had once been law. In Moscow, his embalmed body lay beside Lenin's in a crystal coffin, a symbol of eternal authority, while behind closed doors, his inner circle argued over how to undo the very terror they had helped create. For a time, the myth held. Newspapers continued to call him the greatest genius of humanity. His name remained sacred in textbooks, yet the truth began to seep through the cracks. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech, a thunderclap of revelation. He spoke of purges, executions, and the oceans of blood spilled in the name of one man's paranoia. The audience sat frozen, some in tears, others in disbelief. For the first time, the Soviet people heard their own government admit that their immortal leader had been a murderer. The myth of Stalin's perfection crumbled overnight. But myths die slowly. Even after official denunciation, statues still stood, songs still praised his wisdom, and many still whispered that the nation had been stronger under him. For some, Stalin remained the symbol of order in a world of uncertainty, a ghost of the past haunting the Soviet future. His body was eventually removed from Lenin's mausoleum in 1961 and buried near the Kremlin wall, without ceremony, guarded by silence. Today, his legacy remains divided between memory and myth. To some, he is still the man who saved Russia. To others, he is the face of its deepest wounds. The truth lies somewhere colder. Stalin did not make the Soviet Union immortal. He made it hollow. His empire of fear collapsed decades after his death, built on the same lies that once made him godlike. The myth of Stalin's immortality was his final deception. In the end, the man who demanded statues instead of truth left behind nothing that endured except the memory of what fear can build, and how quickly it dies once the silence is broken. Fact 13. The myth of Stalin as the self-made revolutionary. Soviet mythology portrayed Stalin as the humble son of a poor Georgian shoemaker who rose, through intelligence and devotion to Marxism, to become the leader of the world's first socialist state. School books told of a young idealist who studied by candlelight, defied the Tsar, and dedicated his life to the liberation of workers. His youth was painted as a story of sacrifice and destiny, the poor boy who became a giant of history. But the real story of Stalin's rise was built not on principle or genius, but on deception, manipulation, and ruthless opportunism. Born Ioseb Jugashvili in 1878 in the Georgian town of Gori, Stalin's early years were marked not by heroism, but by mediocrity. He was expelled from seminary for absenteeism and political mischief, not for defying tyranny. His early revolutionary activity often revolved around petty crime, robbing banks, smuggling money, and organizing violent strikes. In one infamous incident in 1907, his gang ambushed a convoy in Tiflis, killing dozens while stealing funds for the Bolshevik Party. Lenin later approved the act, but it was not Marxism that guided Stalin's hand. It was survival. Unlike the intellectual revolutionaries who debated theory in exile, Stalin preferred power in the shadows. He was never an orator, never a philosopher, and contributed little to ideology. His gift was darker, the ability to sense weakness in others. Within the Bolshevik movement, he became an organizer, then a spy, then a manipulator of networks, quietly collecting secrets and favors. He forged documents, spread rumors, and turned comrades against one another. When Lenin was exiled abroad, Stalin stayed in Russia, building alliances with those too insignificant for others to notice. By the time of the 1917 revolution, he was still a minor figure, hardly mentioned in reports of the Petrograd uprising. Yet within a decade, he would stand at the top of the Soviet state. His true ascent began not with the revolution, but with Lenin's illness. As general secretary, Stalin used his control of appointments to fill the party with loyal subordinates. While others argued about ideology, he built a bureaucracy that owed everything to him. Lenin, in his final years, saw the danger. In his last testament, he called Stalin too rude and warned the party to remove him. But Lenin's words were suppressed after his death in 1924 by Stalin himself. The myth of the self-made revolutionary was perfected afterward. Stalin ordered his early photographs retouched, his Georgian accent softened in recordings, and his criminal past erased. New biographies turned him into a saint of socialism, the tireless comrade who never wavered. His old rivals, from Trotsky to Bukharin, were recast as enemies of the people. The revolution was rewritten until Stalin stood alone at its center, as if the entire history of Soviet power had been born from his will. But the real foundation of his rise was not devotion to the cause. It was mastery of fear. He learned that loyalty could be bought and dissent erased. His revolution was not Marx's dream, but his own, a revolution of obedience. By the time the myth was complete, Stalin had buried everyone who remembered the truth. The poor shoemaker's son had indeed remade himself, not as a hero of the people, but as the man who convinced them he was one. Fact 14. The myth of Stalin's humility and simplicity. Official portraits showed Stalin as a modest man, a leader untouched by vanity, living a simple life among his people. He wore the same plain tunic, the same heavy boots. He supposedly disliked luxury, despised privilege, and lived only for duty. Propaganda described him as the first among equals, a servant of the working class who shunned excess. The reality, hidden from public eyes, was that Stalin's simplicity was carefully staged, a costume worn by a ruler who lived in quiet opulence, insulated by fear, and surrounded by comforts denied to millions. The man who spoke of equality lived in palaces. His primary residence, the Kuntsevo dacha outside Moscow, was a fortress disguised as a country home. Marble floors, manicured gardens, private cinemas, and a personal chef who prepared imported delicacies. While the people of Moscow stood in lines for bread, Stalin's table held fruits from Georgia, caviar, fine wines, and freshly roasted meats. His meals could last for hours, accompanied by music and Georgian toasts, while soldiers returning from the front shared watery soup and rationed vodka. He collected luxury and secrecy. Rare watches, French tobacco, expensive boots, even a personal projectionist who screened American films nightly. His modest office in the Kremlin was larger than a cathedral hall, filled with Persian carpets and foreign gifts. Yet every image released to the public was cropped, dimly lit, stripped of ornament, the illusion of simplicity maintained by photographers who knew their lives depended on getting it right. Even his plain dress was deception. The famous khaki tunic, supposedly a sign of solidarity with the common soldier, was custom-tailored and pressed daily by servants. Its simplicity made him appear ascetic, almost monk-like, the opposite of the decadent czars he had replaced. But the discipline was theatrical. When foreign guests visited, Stalin staged scenes of modest hospitality. A small desk, a single glass of tea, humble furnishings. What they did not see were the guards behind the doors, the hidden telephones, the layers of luxury built just out of sight. His inner circle, too, learned to imitate the performance. Ministers drove foreign cars, but pretended to ride in state vehicles. They furnished their apartments with imported goods, but hid them from photographers. The entire leadership lived in a double reality, one for themselves, another for the people. Stalin demanded this hypocrisy because it served his greatest myth, that he was one of them. Yet the greatest contradiction was not material, but moral. Stalin's supposed humility masked his deepest pride. He demanded worship disguised as admiration, obedience framed as love. When foreign journalists called him modest, he smiled quietly, knowing they had swallowed his lie. When poets wrote of his simple greatness, he ordered their verses printed across the nation. By the time of his death, few Soviet citizens questioned the illusion. They truly believed their leader lived like them, poor, disciplined, tireless. Only after the archives opened decades later did the truth emerge. Stalin's simplicity was a masterpiece of propaganda, crafted with precision to hide the fact that he had become everything he claimed to destroy. He lived as an emperor cloaked in peasant clothes, a man who ruled by pretending not to rule, who owned everything yet demanded to be seen as owning nothing. His humility was not a virtue, it was camouflage for absolute power. Fact 15. The myth of Stalin's fearless nature. In every painting, film, and speech, Stalin appeared unshakable, a man without fear. Propaganda called him the mountain of courage, the leader who never flinched under pressure, never doubted, never trembled. His portraits gazed forward with calm defiance, as if no force on earth could move him. This image of the fearless commander became the cornerstone of Soviet mythology. Yet those who worked beside him knew another Stalin, a man consumed by suspicion, haunted by betrayal, and terrified of death. Behind the mask of iron resolve was a soul devoured by paranoia. From the 1930s onward, Stalin trusted no one. He slept in different rooms each night, never revealing his location even to his guards until the last moment. Maps of his routes were burned after every journey. His security detail rotated constantly, not for safety from enemies, but from himself. He feared they might conspire to kill him. Even his food was tested by doctors before each meal, and dishes were sometimes switched mid-course to confuse any potential poisoner. At times, he refused to eat anything cooked outside his personal kitchen. His dread of assassination bordered on obsession. In 1942, during the darkest months of the war, Stalin refused to leave Moscow even when German bombers were within range, not out of courage, but calculation. He believed if he died, his power would collapse instantly. When visiting the front lines, he did so only under heavy guard and in carefully staged appearances lasting mere minutes. Yet state propaganda later presented these moments as proof of his bravery under fire. The truth was that Stalin's front visits rarely brought him closer to danger than the echo of distant artillery. Even among his closest circle, fear defined his behavior. During late-night meetings at his dacha, he tested loyalty through intimidation, accusing subordinates of treason, watching their reactions, then laughing as they stammered denials. To him, fear was proof of devotion, but he also feared those very men. The moment one of them gained too much popularity, Stalin struck first. Arrests, forced confessions, executions. The list of those he killed reads like a catalog of his own insecurities. Generals who outshone him, scientists who contradicted him, friends who knew him too well. In his final years, fear turned inward. He became obsessed with illness. The death of his second wife had already unbalanced him, but as his body weakened, his paranoia grew. He trusted no doctors, believing the Jewish physician's conspiracy invented by his own propaganda might somehow be true. He stopped medical examinations, dismissed his staff, and spent his nights pacing the halls of his dacha, muttering about plots and poison. When he finally suffered a stroke in March 1953, his guards hesitated for hours before entering his room, too terrified to disturb him. By the time they did, the fearless Stalin lay half-conscious on the floor, his hand clawing at the carpet. The man who built an empire on terror had lived enslaved by it. His fear of death had shaped his entire rule. The purges, the executions, the endless suspicion, all were his way of killing before being killed. And yet, to the world outside, the myth endured. The unbreakable leader, the man without fear. But in the end, fear was not only Stalin's companion, it was his legacy. He infected a nation with it so deeply that even after his death, people still whispered his name. The mountain of courage had turned out to be hollow, trembling from within. Fact 16. The myth of Stalin's devotion to Lenin's legacy. For decades, Soviet citizens were taught that Stalin was Lenin's truest disciple, the guardian of his ideals, the faithful executor of his vision. Posters showed Lenin pointing toward a radiant future, Stalin beside him, carrying the torch. Textbooks declared that Stalin merely continued Lenin's work. Every anniversary of Lenin's death became a ritual of loyalty, with speeches praising Stalin as the heir of the revolution. But behind the slogans and statues was one of the greatest lies in Soviet history. Stalin didn't preserve Lenin's legacy. He buried it. When Lenin died in January 1924, his final months had been spent in frustration and fear. He saw the rise of bureaucracy within the party, the growing arrogance of its new general secretary, and the danger of personal dictatorship. In his last letters, later called Lenin's Testament, he warned the party explicitly: Stalin was too rude, unfit for leadership, and should be removed from power. But Stalin, who already controlled the party's secretariat and its files, ensured that the document never reached the wider membership. He silenced it quietly, replacing the dying Lenin's warnings with orchestrated grief. Then came the Great Appropriation. Lenin's body was embalmed against his widow's wishes and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, turning the revolutionary into a secular saint. Stalin understood the symbolism immediately. By making Lenin eternal, he made himself the high priest of Lenin's immortality. He ordered the construction of shrines, parades, and endless portraits pairing their images together. To criticize Stalin now meant to risk being labeled anti-Leninist. Through this sanctification, he erased the man while preserving the myth, and in doing so, replaced the revolution's ideals with his own rule. The contrast between Lenin's words and Stalin's deeds was vast. Lenin had denounced the death penalty, calling it a temporary measure. Stalin made execution an institution. Lenin had encouraged debate within the party. Stalin replaced debate with obedience. Lenin envisioned socialism built on workers' councils. Stalin built it on labor camps. Even Lenin's cautious tolerance toward religion was shattered. Stalin waged war on the church, destroying thousands of temples and imprisoning priests. And while Lenin had imagined the state eventually withering away, Stalin transformed it into the most powerful and intrusive apparatus in history. He not only redefined Lenin's ideas, he rewrote them. Party publications edited Lenin's works, removing criticisms and altering context. Photographs were retouched to include Stalin standing closer to Lenin than he ever had in real life. When old Bolsheviks tried to correct the record, they were accused of heresy and executed during the purges. By the late 1930s, Stalin's version of Lenin had become unrecognizable, a silent prophet whose every word now seemed to predict Stalin's own rise. The myth of Stalin as Lenin's heir was perhaps his most successful illusion. It allowed him to legitimize terror as continuity, tyranny as destiny. Each crime was framed as the fulfillment of Lenin's plan, every purge a cleansing of enemies of the revolution. And when the people looked up at the two faces carved together in stone, they saw not betrayal, but lineage, the father and the son of socialism. But Lenin's real legacy was buried long before his body. The man who dreamed of a classless society was replaced by the man who ruled through classes of fear. Stalin had not inherited Lenin's revolution. He had embalmed it, drained it of life, and sealed it in glass. His devotion was never to Lenin's vision, but to his own immortality. And so, in the shadow of Lenin's tomb, Stalin built his empire, not as a continuation of the revolution, but as its grave. Fact 17. The myth of Stalin as the savior of the Red Army. Official Soviet history praised Stalin as the father and protector of the Red Army, the leader who built its strength, guided its victories, and forged the military machine that defeated Nazi Germany. Parades in Red Square marched beneath banners reading, "Under Stalin's leadership, the army became invincible." Films showed him visiting the front, calmly directing battles, his mere presence turning chaos into triumph. But the truth, recorded in classified war archives and veterans' testimonies, exposes a darker reality. Stalin nearly destroyed the Red Army before it ever fought a single battle. The roots of this tragedy lay in the Great Purge. Between 1937 and 1939, Stalin's paranoia turned toward his own generals. He feared the army's independence and imagined conspiracies where none existed. Within 2 years, over 35,000 officers were arrested, imprisoned, or executed, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and hundreds of colonels and specialists. Marshal Tukhachevsky, one of the most brilliant military minds of his generation, was tortured into confessing imaginary treason before being shot. The entire officer corps was gutted, replaced with politically loyal but inexperienced men. The results were catastrophic. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and then turned toward the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin's army looked powerful on paper. Massive numbers of tanks, aircraft, and soldiers, but lacked leadership, coordination, and initiative. The officers who remained were terrified of making decisions without orders. Training had been replaced by political indoctrination. Modernization projects were stalled by bureaucracy and fear. Even the weapons Stalin boasted of, like the new T-34 tank and Katyusha rockets, were available only in limited numbers, often without proper ammunition or logistics. During the initial days of Operation Barbarossa, this fear-stricken army collapsed in chaos. Commanders hesitated to move troops without Stalin's approval. By the time orders arrived, German panzers had already surrounded them. Entire armies were annihilated. Millions were captured. Stalin's first reaction was not to reform, but to blame. He accused generals of treachery, ordered executions, and reinstated the system of political commissars to oversee and control every military decision. Fear became military doctrine. And yet, the propaganda machine turned the disaster into myth. When victory eventually came, Stalin was painted as the genius who had transformed defeat into triumph. The reality was that the army had saved itself through adaptation, sacrifice, and the leadership of men Stalin had once distrusted. Commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky rebuilt the Red Army's confidence, often by defying or bending Stalin's impossible orders. Ironically, some of these men had been imprisoned or tortured in the purges years earlier. Even after the war, Stalin's distrust never faded. He viewed decorated officers as potential rivals. Marshal Zhukov, the hero of Berlin, was exiled to a minor post after 1946 and accused of Bonapartism. Veterans who spoke truthfully about the chaos of 1941 risked arrest. History was rewritten to portray the Red Army's survival as proof of Stalin's foresight, not the courage of its soldiers. The real saviors of the Red Army were the men and women who endured, who fought not for ideology, but to stay alive. Stalin's role was not that of protector, but destroyer turned opportunist, who claimed credit for victories he nearly prevented. The myth of Stalin as the army's father survives in statues and parades, but every grave across the Eastern Front tells another story, that the Red Army triumphed despite him, not because of him. Fact 18. The myth of Stalin's mastery of propaganda. To the outside world, Stalin's control of information seemed absolute, a perfectly engineered machine of loyalty. Soviet citizens saw the same headlines, heard the same speeches, repeated the same slogans. The image was one of total command. Stalin as the grand manipulator, a master of persuasion who bent truth to his will. But in reality, his propaganda empire was less a system of genius than a mirror of his own paranoia, chaotic, self-contradictory, and often detached from reality. It succeeded not through brilliance, but through fear. The cult of personality that surrounded him didn't arise overnight. It was constructed out of desperation. After Lenin's death, Stalin faced a legitimacy crisis. He lacked Lenin's charisma, his intellect, his revolutionary aura. So he replaced respect with worship. State artists were ordered to make him taller, stronger, more noble. Writers received direct instructions to describe his eyes as kind yet wise. Even the way he smoked his pipe was turned into a symbol of wisdom. The propaganda didn't reflect who Stalin was. It created a man who didn't exist. The machine that produced this illusion was enormous. By the late 1930s, every newspaper, publishing house, and film studio was under the supervision of the party's agitprop department. But the constant rewriting of truth made consistency impossible. One year, the Soviet Union was a friend of Nazi Germany. The next, it was leading the fight against fascism. Yesterday's allies became today's traitors. Entire encyclopedias were recalled to remove the names of purged officials. Photographs were retouched so meticulously that some images eventually contained more lies than light. Even school books were rewritten overnight. A child could go to bed with one version of history and wake up to another. The power of Stalin's propaganda lay not in what it told people, but in what it taught them not to question. It trained citizens to forget, to adapt, to survive the changing tides of truth. People learned to read between the lines, to nod silently at absurdities while pretending to believe. The more unbelievable the propaganda became, the more dangerous disbelief was. It wasn't persuasion that made it effective. It was terror. Yet even this system betrayed its master. Stalin's censorship made him blind to reality. His ministers, desperate to avoid his anger, filled reports with lies that matched official propaganda. Record harvests, booming industries, loyal citizens. The country he ruled on paper existed only in imagination. When famine ravaged Ukraine, newspapers published articles about unprecedented prosperity. When factories broke down, they reported exceeding production goals. Stalin, surrounded by a wall of false triumphs, came to believe his own myths. By the end of his life, propaganda had devoured truth so completely that even his death was staged as performance. When he died in 1953, newspapers called him the greatest genius in human history. His corpse was displayed beside Lenin's under spotlights and red velvet, as if to assure the people that the sun itself had not gone out. But the silence that followed revealed the truth. The machine had no voice without him. Stalin's mastery of propaganda was not mastery at all. It was a system so afraid of truth that it drowned in its own inventions. The power of his image came not from genius, but from terror, and when terror ended, so did belief. The myth of his perfect control over minds was one last illusion. In trying to rule reality, Stalin destroyed it. Fact 19. The myth of Stalin's peaceful intentions. After the war, after 1945, Soviet propaganda reinvented Stalin once more, no longer the wartime commander, but the defender of peace. Posters showed him holding a dove, smiling beneath a globe encircled by olive branches. State media called him the guardian of humanity's future, who alone prevented another world war. To millions at home and abroad, he appeared as the sober voice of reason against Western aggression. Yet, beneath this saintly disguise, Stalin's post-war policy was anything but peaceful. Behind closed doors, he built a world of suspicion, expansion, and nuclear fear, the foundations of the Cold War itself. The myth began the moment the guns fell silent. While cities lay in ruins and families mourned their dead, Stalin saw opportunity. Europe, divided and devastated, was a chessboard he intended to dominate. Between 1945 and 1948, one country after another fell under Soviet control: Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. Liberation became occupation. Elections became theater. The Red Army, which had freed half of Europe, now stood as its jailer. Stalin called it a defensive measure against imperialism. In truth, it was the creation of a vast buffer zone under his iron authority. His idea of peace meant obedience. Any nation that refused to follow Moscow's line was condemned as an enemy. In 1948, Yugoslavia's Tito broke with Stalin over independence. and instantly became a traitor to socialism. Stalin sent assassins, orchestrated purges in neighboring countries, and branded entire populations as potential conspirators. Eastern Europe turned into a continent of fear, where dissent was treason and silence survival. While preaching peace, Stalin quietly prepared for war. Soviet scientists under NKVD supervision accelerated their nuclear program using stolen Western research. German engineers captured from Berlin were forced to work in secret laboratories across the USSR. The same man who spoke of coexistence built vast stockpiles of weapons and fortified his borders with armies and mines. He once told his generals, "A long peace breeds weakness. The West must remain afraid." Even within his own country, paranoia grew. The late 1940s saw the Leningrad affair, a wave of arrests against officials accused of forming a regional conspiracy. Thousands were executed. In 1952, Stalin launched his final campaign of terror, the Doctor's Plot, accusing Jewish physicians of planning to poison Soviet leaders. The propaganda that once promised peace now screamed of internal enemies, foreign plots, and spies hiding in hospitals. The country braced for another purge, and possibly another war. To the outside world, Stalin's diplomacy wore a mask of restraint. He appeared calm, deliberate, grandfatherly. Western journalists who met him in person described his quiet voice, his thoughtful pauses. But in the privacy of his Kremlin office, he scrawled orders in red pencil, demanding purges and executions even as he spoke of world harmony. His peace was not the absence of war, it was the silence of control. When he died in 1953, Soviet newspapers mourned the greatest peacemaker in history. Yet his passing was followed by an almost immediate thaw in East-West relations. Political prisoners were released. The Doctor's Plot was declared a fabrication. The machine of terror slowed. Only then did the world understand what Stalin's peace had truly meant, the enforced stillness of a terrified empire. The myth of Stalin's peaceful intentions remains one of his most cynical creations. He did not protect peace, he weaponized it. His peace was a mask worn over paranoia, a calm voice hiding the grind of tanks beneath the ground. In his world, peace was not freedom from war. It was the pause between purges. Fact 20. The myth of Stalin's necessary evil. Even after his crimes became undeniable, a dangerous idea lingered, that Stalin, though brutal, had been necessary. That without his terror, the Soviet Union would have fallen. That he had done what had to be done. Many who lived through his reign later whispered, "He was cruel, but he saved the country." It is the final myth, the one that keeps his shadow alive. But history shows that Stalin's cruelty did not save the Soviet Union, it nearly destroyed it. This myth was born in the aftermath of war. The Soviet people had endured unthinkable suffering, invasion, starvation, purges, loss. In that pain, propaganda offered a comforting lie, that all of it had meaning, that every arrest, every bullet, every grave dug in the frozen earth was part of a larger purpose, victory, progress, security. The regime called it historical necessity. But there was no necessity in the murder of poets, the starvation of peasants, or the execution of generals. None of it made the country stronger. It made it silent. The Soviet Union's greatest achievements, its victory over Nazism, its industrial strength, its scientific triumphs, were not born from Stalin's cruelty, but in spite of it. The tanks that rolled into Berlin were built by workers who feared arrest if production faltered. The rockets that reached the stratosphere came from scientists who survived his prisons. The very loyalty that held the country together came not from love of Stalin, but from the instinct to endure. His iron will didn't forge unity, it crushed it. And when he died, that unity cracked like glass. In truth, Stalin's so-called necessity was the justification of fear, the excuse tyrants always use. He convinced a generation that freedom was chaos, that mercy was weakness, that terror was strength. And long after his death, that belief survived, that suffering is proof of greatness, that progress requires sacrifice. It is the most poisonous legacy he left behind. The Soviet Union did not collapse because Stalin was too weak. It collapsed because he made it too brittle. The system he built could not evolve, could not trust, could not breathe. It could only obey. And when fear finally lifted, there was nothing left to hold it together. The myth of Stalin as the necessary evil dies under the weight of its own logic. Evil is never necessary, only convenient for those who wield it. Stalin's iron will was never strength. It was fear, disguised as discipline, cruelty, disguised as vision. He did not forge a nation, he froze it. For decades, his myth stood taller than his crimes, carved in marble and memory. But history is patient. It waits beneath the lies. And when the noise of propaganda fades, one truth remains. The empire of fear he built did not survive him. Only the silence did.